The sun was setting over Pine Ridge Farm, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. James Wilson wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked across his fields with tired but proud eyes. At 45, his hands were rough from years of hard work, his face weathered by countless days under the sun. The small farm had been in his family for 3 generations, and despite all the challenges, he was determined to keep it that way. "Just need to check the fence line before heading in," he muttered to himself, glancing at the darkening sky. Storm clouds were rolling in fast, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. James climbed into his old pickup truck, the engine protesting with a groan before rumbling to life. He drove slowly along the edge of his property, checking for any breaks in the fence that might let his livestock wander off during the coming storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the first fat raindrops began to fall, tapping against the truck's metal roof. He was almost done with his rounds when it happened. The sound cut through the patter of rain, a high-pitched screech of tires, followed by the sickening crunch of metal. James jerked his head toward the noise just in time to see bright headlights swerve off the country road that ran alongside his property. The expensive-looking car crashed through the wooden fence and slammed into the massive oak tree that had stood at the corner of his land for over 100 years. Without thinking twice, James stomped on the gas pedal. His truck bumped across the uneven ground as rain began pouring down in sheets. By the time he reached the wreckage, water was streaming down his face, soaking through his flannel shirt. "Hello? Anyone in there?" he called out, running toward the crumpled vehicle. It was some kind of fancy sports car, now bent around the trunk of the oak tree. Smoke was starting to rise from under the crushed hood, mixing with the rain in an ominous hiss. Through the spider-webbed windshield, James could make out a figure slumped over the steering wheel. He tried the door handle, but it was jammed shut from the impact. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the metal as lightning flashed overhead, briefly illuminating the scene. "Hold on," James shouted, though he wasn't sure if the person inside could hear him. He ran back to his truck and grabbed a tire iron from the toolbox in the bed. Returning to the car, he used it to smash the passenger side window, then reached in to unlock the door. Inside, a man in an expensive-looking suit was unconscious, his head bleeding from a nasty gash across his forehead. The airbag had deployed but was now deflated across his chest. A strong smell of gasoline filled the air. James checked for a pulse, relieved to find one. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man didn't respond, but his chest was rising and falling with shallow breaths. Looking around, James knew he had a decision to make. The nearest hospital was almost 30 miles away, and in this storm, emergency services would take forever to reach them. The smoke from the engine was getting thicker and the smell of gas stronger by the second. "Got to get you out of here," James said, pulling out his pocket knife to cut through the jammed seatbelt. He carefully supported the man's neck as he eased him out of the wreckage. The stranger was heavier than he looked, and James staggered under his weight as he carried him through the mud and pouring rain toward his truck. Lightning cracked overhead, briefly revealing the unconscious man's face, pale, middle-aged, with fine lines around his eyes that spoke of both money and worry. His clothes were clearly expensive, a stark contrast to James's worn jeans and work boots. As James laid the injured man across the back seat of his pickup, he had no way of knowing that the life he was saving belonged to Edward Thompson, founder of Global Tech Solutions and worth over $30 billion. He didn't know that this rainy night would change not just Edward's life, but his own and the future of Pine Ridge Farm forever. All James knew was that someone needed help, and he wasn't the kind of man to drive away from that. As he started the engine and turned toward home, his only thought was getting this stranger somewhere safe and warm before it was too late. The old pickup truck bounced along the muddy driveway, its headlights cutting through the pouring rain. James pulled up as close as possible to the back porch of his farmhouse, a 2-story white clapboard home that had weathered countless storms over the decades. "Martha," he called out as he flung open the truck's back door. "Martha, I need help." The screen door swung open, and Martha Wilson appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of her husband struggling to lift an unconscious man from the truck. "Good Lord, James, what happened?" Martha rushed down the steps, ignoring the rain soaking through her clothes. "Car crash by the old oak," James grunted, adjusting his grip on the stranger. "Bad one. Fancy car wrapped around the tree. This fella was trapped inside. Martha, who had worked as a nurse for 15 years before the local clinic closed down, quickly assessed the situation. Let's get him inside. Careful with his head. That's a nasty cut. Together, they carried the injured man into the house. Their 3 children, David, Tanya, and little Anda, gathered in the hallway with wide eyes. David grabbed some towels. Martha instructed her oldest son, Tanya, go get my medical kit from the bathroom cabinet. They laid the stranger on the couch in the living room. In the light, they could see him properly for the first time, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked more used to boardrooms than barnyards. His tailored suit was now torn and bloodied, and an expensive watch glinted on his wrist. Martha cut away the man's shirt sleeve to reveal a badly broken arm. This needs to be set, she said, her voice calm but serious. And that head wound needs stitches. James, we need to get him to a hospital. James shook his head, water dripping from his jacket onto the worn carpet. I tried calling on the way here. The storms knocked out cell service, and Billy from the gas station radioed that the bridge on County Road 8 is flooded out. Can't we take the old logging road? David asked, returning with an armful of towels. Too dangerous in this weather, James replied, especially with him in this condition. Martha was already cleaning the head wound with practiced hands. Then we do what we can here. I'll stitch this up and splint the arm. We'll need to watch for signs of concussion or internal bleeding. The family sprang into action. Martha directed their efforts like a general commanding troops. Tanya, who was just 16 but already talked about becoming a doctor someday, helped her mother thread the needle for stitches. David held a flashlight steady while Andra brought extra pillows. Who do you think he is? Tanya whispered as Martha carefully closed the gash on the man's forehead with neat, small stitches. Doesn't matter who he is, Martha replied without looking up. Right now, he's just someone who needs our help. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the corners of the old farmhouse. The family took turns sitting with their unexpected guest. Around midnight, James managed to get a weak signal on the ancient landline phone and called the county emergency services. They can't get through until morning at the earliest, he told Martha as he hung up. Roads are flooded all over the county. Martha nodded, checking the man's pulse for the 1000th time. His breathing is steadier now. I think he'll make it through the night, but we'll need to keep a close eye on him. James looked down at the stranger on their couch, at the expensive cufflinks still attached to his torn shirt, at the manicured hands that had clearly never plowed a field or fixed a tractor. Wonder what his story is, James mused quietly. Man like that, driving alone on a back road during a storm. We'll find out when he wakes up, Martha said, adjusting the homemade splint on the man's arm. If he wakes up. Outside their window, lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a brief moment. On the mantelpiece stood a framed notice from the bank, a final warning about their overdue mortgage payments. Another flash revealed the family photo beside it, James, Martha, and the kids standing proudly in front of the barn they'd rebuilt last summer after a fire nearly destroyed it. None of them could have guessed that the unconscious man on their couch had enough money in his bank account to buy their farm 100 times over, or that his presence in their home would soon change everything they thought they knew about their future. 3 days passed with the stranger drifting in and out of consciousness. The Wilson family had moved him to their spare bedroom upstairs, a simple room with faded floral wallpaper and a handmade quilt that Martha's grandmother had stitched decades ago. They took turns checking on him, changing his bandages and spooning water between his pale lips. By the 3rd morning, the storm had finally passed. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window as James entered with a fresh glass of water. He was surprised to find the man's eyes open, staring up at the ceiling with confusion. Well, look who's finally decided to join us, James said with a gentle smile, setting the water on the nightstand. The man turned his head slowly, wincing at the pain. His voice came out raspy and dry. Where am I? Pine Ridge Farm, James answered, helping him take a sip of water. About 5 miles east of Henderson. I'm James Wilson. Found you wrapped around my oak tree during that nasty storm a few nights back. The man blinked several times, trying to process this information. The car. I remember the rain, the headlights, then nothing. That fancy car of yours didn't fare too well, I'm afraid, but you're lucky to be alive. James pulled up the old wooden chair next to the bed. My wife Martha patched you up best she could. You've got a broken arm, a concussion, and enough stitches in your head to make a baseball. Doctor from town came by yesterday, said she did as good a job as he would have. The man's free hand moved to the bandage on his forehead. Thank you, he said quietly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same. James paused. Don't believe I caught your name. A brief hesitation. Ed. Edward. Thompson. James nodded, not noticing the slight pause. Well, Ed, you're welcome to stay until you're back on your feet. Phone lines are working again if you need to call anyone. Ed shook his head slightly. No rush. My assistant knows I'm taking some time away. His eyes scanned the modest room, taking in the worn furniture, the patched curtains, the family photos on the dresser. Everything in the room spoke of a life far removed from his own. Over the next few days, Ed's strength gradually returned. He began joining the family downstairs, first just for meals, then spending more time in their living room. He said little about himself, only that he worked in tech and had been heading to a meeting when the accident happened. The Wilsons didn't pry. Folks around these parts respected privacy. What fascinated Ed most was watching the family's daily routines unfold around him. Each morning, James rose before dawn to tend to the animals and fields. The children rushed through breakfast before catching the school bus that rumbled down their dirt road. Martha balanced farm chores with her part-time job at the local library, somehow still finding time to tend to Ed's wounds and cook meals that made his mouth water despite their simplicity. One evening, Ed overheard a tense conversation between James and Martha at the kitchen table. They spoke in hushed tones about the bank, about payments, about possibly selling off the East Field. James's voice was strained as he mentioned something about fourth-generation land and not on my watch. The next day, as Ed sat on the porch watching James work on a broken tractor, he noticed a man in a suit driving up in a shiny car. From his seat, Ed couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the stiffness in James's shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When the man finally left, James stood staring after the car for a long time. That evening at dinner, James was quieter than usual. His youngest child asked why, but Martha quickly changed the subject. Ed watched James push food around his plate, wondering about the weight this proud man carried on his shoulders. Later, as Ed helped Martha with the dishes, insisting despite her protests that he needed to earn his keep, he asked casually about the visitor. Martha's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Bankman," she said simply. "They want our farm. Been in James's family since his great-grandfather bought it after freedom. One bad harvest, one broken-down tractor too many, and suddenly they're circling like vultures." Ed nodded, filing this information away as he carefully dried a chipped plate. What Martha couldn't know was that the man standing beside her in worn borrowed clothes had enough money to buy every bank in the county, and that he was beginning to form a plan. By the end of the week, Ed was strong enough to take short walks around the farm. James, noticing his guest's restlessness, invited him to tag along during the morning chores. Despite his broken arm, Ed eagerly accepted. "Never thought I'd see a man so excited about feeding chickens," James chuckled as they headed toward the coop. The morning air was crisp, dew sparkling on the grass as the sun peeked over the eastern hills. Ed smiled, his designer watch looking out of place against the borrowed flannel shirt. "I've spent too many years in offices. This is refreshing." James handed him a bucket of feed. "Just scatter it around. Watch out for old Betty, she pecks." Ed awkwardly tossed feed with his good arm, laughing as the chickens swarmed around his feet. "I run a company with thousands of employees, but these birds have no respect for authority," he joked. James raised an eyebrow. "Thousands, huh? That tech business must be doing well." Ed hesitated, realizing his slip. Small tech company, nothing fancy. They moved on to the vegetable garden, where Tanya was already pulling weeds. The 16-year-old had taken a liking to their guest, bombarding him with questions about the world beyond their small town. "Is it true people in the city don't know their neighbors?" she asked, wiping soil from her hands. Ed nodded. "I lived in my apartment for 8 years before I learned my neighbor's name." Tanya looked horrified. That's so sad." "It is," Ed agreed, surprised by how much he meant it. Later, James took Ed to the eastern edge of the property, where rows of vegetables stretched toward a small creek. A group of people were working there, harvesting tomatoes and peppers. "Community garden project," James explained. "Started it 5 years ago. Folks who help get to take home food. Rest goes to the senior center and families having hard times." Ed watched as an elderly woman carefully placed tomatoes in her basket. "Your idea?" James nodded. "Land's meant to feed people. My granddaddy taught me that. He built this farm from nothing after coming home from World War I. Back then, black farmers couldn't get the same loans or support as white farmers. He used to say, if you've got enough to share, you're rich enough." Ed fell silent, thinking about the millions sitting in his various accounts, the vacation homes he rarely visited, the art collection he bought because his financial advisor suggested it. "What would you do?" Ed asked suddenly, "if money wasn't a problem? For the farm, I mean." James looked surprised at the question. He gazed across his land thoughtfully before answering. "First, I'd pay off the bank. Can't build dreams on borrowed ground." He pointed to an old barn in the distance. "Then I'd fix that up, make it a proper training center. Teach young folks about sustainable farming, especially kids from the city who've never seen food grow." His voice grew more animated. "I'd expand the community program. Maybe add beehives, an orchard. Help other small farmers stay afloat too. Form a co-op for equipment sharing and better prices." It nodded, memorizing every word. "But that's just daydreaming," James said with a shrug. "Reality is, I'm just trying to hold onto what I've got." That evening after dinner, David showed Ed his college rejection letters. "Got the grades, but not the money," the 18-year-old explained. "Planning to work the farm with Dad this year. Try again next fall." Ed noticed how James's face fell, though he quickly masked it with a smile and a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Just a delay, not a defeat," James said firmly. Later, as the family gathered in the living room, little Andrew brought out a worn chess set. "Dad says you play," he told Ed. "I do," Ed replied, surprised that James had remembered that casual mention. They set up the board, and soon Ed was teaching Andrew the moves. Across the room, Martha mended a torn shirt while Tanya read a thick book on agricultural science borrowed from the library. James and David studied seed catalogs, planning next season's crops as if there was no question the farm would still be theirs. As Ed watched this family, who had nothing compared to him, but everything compared to most, he felt something shift inside him. He hadn't felt this kind of peace in years. Not since before the money, before the fame, before he became Edward Thompson, tech billionaire. Just Ed, a man playing chess with a child who didn't care about his bank account. 2 weeks after the crash, Ed announced at breakfast that it was time for him to leave. The news was met with genuine disappointment from the entire Wilson family. "Are you sure you're well enough?" Martha asked, concern in her eyes as she poured him coffee. "That arm still needs time to heal properly." Ed nodded. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. My driver can pick me up from town tomorrow." Another small lie. His driver was actually his head of security, who'd been frantically searching for him since the crash. One quick email from the town's small library had set things in motion. "I'll drive you in," James offered. "Need to pick up some supplies anyway." That evening, the family prepared a special goodbye dinner. Martha made her famous chicken and dumplings, and Tanya baked an apple pie with fruit from their own trees. The mood was bittersweet as they gathered around the table. "Before I go," Ed said awkwardly, "I'd like to get a photo. To remember you all by." He pulled out a phone that James had retrieved from the wrecked car. It was an older model. Ed kept his real phone with direct access to his empire well hidden. "A photo." Little Andrew beamed. "Like for Instagram." Ed laughed, something like that. They squeezed together on the porch steps as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. James set the timer on Ed's phone and hurried to join the group. The camera clicked, capturing the moment. Ed in borrowed clothes with his arm in a sling, surrounded by the family who had saved his life without knowing who he really was. The next morning, James drove Ed to Henderson. The town was small, just a main street with essential businesses and a park in the center. Ed asked to stop at the local bank first. Mind if I handle something quickly? He asked. James shrugged. Take your time. I'll be at the hardware store when you're done. Inside the bank, Ed spoke privately with the manager, making a call on his secure phone that he'd kept hidden during his stay. 20 minutes later, he emerged with a small smile and found James loading bags of feed into his truck. All set? James asked. Almost, Ed replied. Can we grab coffee? There's something I'd like to talk about. At the town's only cafe, they sat by the window. Ed stirred his coffee nervously. James, I haven't been entirely honest with you. James's expression remained calm. Figured as much. Man like you doesn't end up on a back road in a car like that without a story. Ed smiled. You're perceptive. He took a deep breath. I'd like to help you with the farm, the bank, everything. James's face hardened slightly. We don't take charity. Not charity, Ed insisted. An investment. In your community garden program, in your ideas for teaching young farmers. I believe in what you're doing. James studied him carefully. And why would you do that? You hardly know us. Because you saved my life without knowing anything about me, Ed said simply. Because your family treated me like a person, not. He traveled off. Not what? James asked. Before Ed could answer, his phone rang. He glanced at it. My ride is here. They walked outside to find 3 black SUVs parked in front of the cafe. Men in suits stood beside them, looking relieved when they spotted Ed. Mr. Thompson, one rushed forward. Thank goodness. Everyone's been so worried. James looked from the man to Ed, confusion on his face. Thompson. Atin. At that moment, a local news van pulled up. A reporter jumped out, camera operator close behind. Mr. Thompson. Edward Thompson. Can you confirm that you've been missing since the storm 2 weeks ago? Is it true you were in a car accident? Ed sighed, then turned to face a stunned James. I was going to tell you. My full name is Edward Thompson. I founded Global Tech Solutions. James's eyes widened as realization dawned. Everyone in America knew that name, the man who had revolutionized mobile technology worth billions. You're... James couldn't finish the sentence. Yes, Ed said quietly. And I owe you more than I can ever repay. Your family didn't just save my life. You reminded me what living actually means. The reporter was now filming them, capturing James's shocked expression as his world shifted on its axis. In the space of 5 minutes, the man he'd pulled from a wrecked car, the man who'd fed his chickens and played chess with his son, had transformed into one of the richest people on the planet. And he was looking at James not with the eyes of a billionaire, but with the eyes of a friend. The news spread through Henderson like wildfire. By the time James drove home, his phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from neighbors and friends who had seen the story breaking on local TV. James answered none of them, his mind still trying to process the morning's events. When he pulled into the driveway, Martha and the kids rushed out to meet him. Is it true? Martha asked, her eyes wide. Tanya's teacher called, said the man staying with us was Edward Thompson, the billionaire. James nodded slowly. Seems our guest wasn't just some regular guy after all. Inside, they gathered around their small TV, watching as Ed's face appeared on the news. He stood in front of a microphone, looking much different in his tailored suit than he had in James's borrowed clothes. Yes, I was in an accident during the storm, Ed was saying. My car crashed on a rural road, and I was rescued by a local farmer named James Wilson and his family. They took me in, cared for my injuries, and showed me extraordinary kindness, without having any idea who I was. The reporter asked, did they ask for anything when they found out your identity? Ed shook his head firmly. That's what makes this story remarkable. The Wilsons are good people who helped me because I needed help, not because they wanted something. In my world, that kind of genuine compassion is rare. The Wilson family sat in stunned silence as they watched. He seemed so normal, David said finally. He is normal, James replied. Just has a lot more money than most folks. The next morning, a fleet of vehicles turned onto their dirt road. 3 black SUVs, a moving truck, and a sleek silver sports car kicked up dust as they approached the farmhouse. The family stood on the porch, watching nervously as Ed stepped out of the lead vehicle. He looked different now, hair perfectly trimmed, expensive suit, no sling on his arm, but his smile was the same as he walked toward them. "I hope you don't mind me coming back," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, "and bringing a few things." From the moving truck, workers began unloading farm equipment, a brand new tractor, tools, and supplies. The children gasped as two men carried a large box labeled "Computer Systems" toward the house. James stepped forward, his expression a mix of confusion and pride. "Mr. Thompson." "Ed," he corrected. "Please." "I was Ed when I slept on your couch. I'm still Ed now." "This is too much," James said quietly. "We didn't help you to get anything in return." Ed nodded. "I know. That's exactly why I'm doing this." He gestured for James to follow him a short distance from the house, out of earshot of the others. "Yesterday at the bank," Ed said, "I paid off your mortgage." James froze. "You what?" "The land is yours now, free and clear. No bank can ever take it." James stared at him, speechless. "But that's just the beginning," Ed continued. "Remember when you told me what you'd do if money wasn't a problem? The teaching center, the expanded community garden, helping other small farmers?" Ed's eyes were bright with excitement. "I want to help make that happen. Not as charity, but as a partnership." "Partnership?" James asked, finding his voice. "I've set up a foundation, the Wilson Agricultural Education Center. You'll run it. Full funding, your vision. Teaching sustainable farming to the next generation, just like you wanted." James looked back at his farmhouse, at his family watching curiously from the porch. "Why would you do all this?" Ed was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks ago, I had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. I was heading to a meeting about making more millions when I crashed into your tree." He smiled. "Sometimes life gives you the wake-up call you need." James shook his head in disbelief. "This is life-changing?" Ed finished. "It was for me too, when your family took me in." Back at the house, Tanya was jumping up and down as someone unloaded boxes of agricultural science books. David stood stunned as Ed's assistant explained that his college tuition would be fully covered. Martha wiped away tears as she read a letter offering her a paid position at the new education center. James looked from his celebrating family back to Ed. "I don't even know what to say." Ed extended his hand. "Say you'll show me how to really make a difference with all this money I've been sitting on. I've got the resources, but you've got the wisdom." As they shook hands, a photographer from the local paper captured the moment, a handshake between two men from different worlds, starting something neither could have imagined 2 weeks earlier. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. The old Wilson farmhouse still stood at the center of the property, though it had been carefully restored. The faded white paint was now fresh, the sagging porch rebuilt, but James had insisted on keeping the home's original character. "Some things shouldn't change just because you can afford to," he'd said. Around it, however, everything had transformed. The broken-down barn had become the Wilson Agricultural Education Center, a modern facility where farmers from across the country came to learn sustainable growing practices. The community garden had expanded to cover 10 acres, feeding hundreds of families in need. Solar panels gleamed on south-facing roofs, and a small wind turbine turned lazily on the hill behind the house. On a warm spring day, a group of city kids piled out of a bus, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of growing things. This was the third school tour this week, part of an educational program that brought urban youth to experience farm life firsthand. James walked among the rows of vegetables, answering questions from excited children who had never seen food growing before. At 50, his hair was starting to gray at the temples, but his step was lighter these days, his shoulders no longer burdened by financial worry. "Mr. Wilson, did you really save a billionaire?" a small boy asked, looking up at him with curious eyes. James smiled. "I just helped someone who needed help." "Turns out he was a billionaire, but I didn't know that at the time." "Would you still have helped him if you knew?" another child asked. "Of course," James replied without hesitation. "We help because people need help, not because of who they are." Across the field, David was demonstrating a drone that monitored crop health. Now in his final year of agricultural engineering, he had developed new technologies specifically for small-scale farmers who couldn't afford expensive equipment. His inventions had already won national awards and were being used on farms across 3 states. Tanya was home from college for the weekend. She stood in the greenhouse, showing visitors the experimental crops she was developing as part of her doctoral research, drought-resistant varieties that could help farmers adapt to climate change. At 21, she had already co-authored 2 scientific papers and turned down job offers from major agricultural corporations. Martha moved between groups, her camera capturing moments for the center's website. She had discovered a talent for photography and storytelling, documenting the transformation of struggling small farms into thriving operations. Her photo essays had been featured in national magazines, bringing attention to the challenges and triumphs of rural America. Little Andra, not so little anymore at 14, led a group through the tech lab where farmers learned to use simple software to track their crops and expenses. The shy boy had grown into a confident teenager who dreamed of combining technology and agriculture in new ways. A sleek car pulled up the driveway and Ed stepped out. He visited at least once a month, sometimes more often when city life became too overwhelming. He looked different now, his expensive suits replaced by casual clothes, his formerly clean-shaven face sporting a short beard. The hard-driving billionaire had softened around the edges. James greeted him with a warm handshake that turned into a hug, just in time. "The kids are asking about the crash again." Ed laughed. "Best accident of my life." They walked together toward the old oak tree that had stopped Ed's car that stormy night. They had preserved it, building a small seating area around its massive trunk where visitors could rest in its shade. "The foundation approved all 20 grant applications," Ed said as they walked. "That's 50 new farms getting support this year." James nodded with satisfaction. Their work had grown beyond what either of them had imagined. The Wilson-Thompson Rural Development Initiative now operated in 12 states, helping minority farmers keep their land and young people start new farms. "Sometimes I wonder," James said thoughtfully, "what would have happened if I hadn't checked the fence line that night." Ed looked at the thriving farm around them, at the children learning, the land producing, the community growing stronger. "I'd probably still be in board meetings, making more money I didn't need. And I might have lost this place," James added. They reached the oak tree and sat on the bench beneath it. A small plaque told the story of the crash, how a random accident had connected 2 men from different worlds and changed both their lives. "Funny how things work out," James said, watching his family guide visitors around the farm. "One moment can change everything." It nodded. One moment and one choice to help a stranger.